Hi folks, this is Mr. Oleson. Let's do some econ. We're continuing our analysis of monopolies today, and we're going to look at two topics. First, we're going to look at regulating monopolies, and then second, we're going to look at something called price discrimination. So we established last class that monopolies are not efficient. They're neither productively efficient nor allocatively efficient. And we also learned that in comparison to perfect competition, monopolies overcharge and they underproduce based on what society would want. So how could we deal with this? Well, there are two ways the government can deal with this. The first is by developing antitrust laws. And antitrust laws are designed to prevent monopolies and promote competition within industries. So unless the monopoly is a natural monopoly, all other things equal in general, the government may want to break this up. In the US, antitrust laws go back to the Progressive era with national consolidation after the Civil War. And the most important antitrust law is the Sherman Act of 1890, which said that every person who shall monopolize or conspire to monopolize shall be deemed guilty of a felony. This is the major piece of legislation we have here in the US, and it was passed in 1890. So this hasn't been updated in a while. In the context of big tech companies today, it's going to be really interesting to see if Congress responds and updates antitrust legislation in the context of Google and Facebook and Amazon. But for now, this is the big one that's on the books. When we get into Unit 6, we're going to talk in a lot more depth about market failures, right? And what should happen when markets fail. Monopolies are an example of a market failure, okay? They're an example of markets not working the way that we want them to. They destroy competition, and monopolies are an example of when we actually want the government to get involved. So last unit, we looked at perfect competition, and we looked at examples of when markets worked really, really well, and they were an efficient way that society could use its resources to be allocatively efficient and productively efficient. Monopolies are not doing that, right? So this is an example of when we even the most free market of economists want the government to get involved to fix things. So they could do that by busting up the monopoly, breaking up the company with antitrust laws, or they could regulate the monopoly. So if we're going to allow a monopoly to exist, maybe because we want that drug company to have a patent, maybe because it's a natural monopoly like a public utility, how are we going to regulate them to make to address some of the concerns that we've already talked about? Okay, well, why would we regulate a monopoly, right? What would be our goals? So if we're going to create some new regulations for monopolies, what would be our goals? Number one, to keep prices low. You guys already know now on the graph that monopolists charge a higher price than competitive firms do. Okay, so we could regulate them to lower the price, and we could regulate them to create more efficiency, right? So those are would be our two goals. What I want you to pause and think about for a second is, how could we regulate them? What tools do you have at your disposal to regulate monopolies and help them lower the prices and become more efficient? Well, the main answer is price controls. And in fact, price ceilings are what we're going to use primarily to regulate monopolies. This is different. Remember, you'll recall back in Unit 2, when we introduced price ceilings, we did not like price ceilings because they created deadweight loss. They were an intervention on a monopoly that was, they were an intervention on a market that was working. So by adding a price ceiling in there, we were creating deadweight loss. In this instance, because the monopoly in and of itself is not efficient, we actually want the government to come in and set some price ceilings, okay? One thing that you should never do is tax monopoly, okay? And the reason is because taxes are going to limit the supply, and that's the whole problem here. So we can talk about that a little bit later, but you counterintuitively never want to tax a monopoly to address their problems, because it's ultimately going to make the problems worse, because the problems are they overcharge and underproduce, and taxing them, especially on a per unit basis, is just going to compound those problems. All right, so if we are going to advocate for using price ceilings, the next question is, where the heck should we put them? Okay, so we have two options on where we're going to put a price ceiling on monopoly. The first option is the socially optimum price. To find the socially optimum price, you look for the allocatively efficient point on the graph, which is, of course, where price equals marginal cost. The second place you can put a price ceiling is what's known as the fair return price, or the break-even price. And this is where price equals the ATC. If you set a price ceiling where price equals ATC, then that firm will earn a normal profit. Their total revenue will equal their total cost, and they'll get a fair return, but no more extra normal profit like a unregulated monopoly would get to enjoy. So let's look at the graph and actually spot these points. Take a look at this just by way of quick review. You are now looking at a natural monopoly. So what I want you to think about right now is how can you look at this graph and tell just by looking at it that it's a natural monopoly? Okay, well, the answer is because if you find the socially optimum quantity, at that socially optimum quantity, the ATC is still falling. And because the ATC is still falling at the socially optimum quantity, it's telling us that it's actually better to only have one firm. And one firm can produce at the socially optimal quantity at the lowest possible cost because of economies of scale. Okay, so that's what's happening here in terms of how we know this is a national monopoly. Let's throw some price ceilings on it. Okay, first point of comparison we want to look at is what would this firm do if it was not regulated? Okay, so if this was an unregulated monopoly, what would it do? Well, it would do what all firms want to do. They want to profit maximize. So they look at the tattoo on my arm and they say, we want to produce where MR equals MC. They would go up to the demand curve and over, and they would charge PM. So it's a price for the monopolist, and they would choose QM, the quantity for the monopolist. Okay, so that's kind of the first price and quantity scenario that an unregulated monopoly would produce. The next option would be to set a price ceiling, in this case at the fair return price. How do you find the fair return price? You look for the intercept between the ATC and the price. The demand curve gives us our prices, right? So that's where the ATC crosses the demand curve. When you find the point where the ATC crosses the demand curve, then you dot that down to find your fair return quantity, and then you dot that over to find your fair return price. If the government said you're only allowed to charge this price and no higher, then the quantity that would be produced would be QFR here, and that firm would earn a normal profit. Finally, we could set a socially optimal price ceiling. This would actually eliminate the deadweight loss because we would be at the socially optimal point where price equals the marginal cost. And again, the demand curve gives us our price. This is the socially optimum quantity because it's where a perfectly competitive market would also produce. And it would, in this instance, give us the highest quantity here at Q socially optimal. And then it would bring the price down to QSO here. So those are how you find the possible points to set ceilings. Okay, I want you to think about something interesting though. If the government chose to set a price ceiling for this particular monopoly at the socially optimum point, I want you to think what would happen. So kind of analyze what's going there. One thing that should be immediately clear to you is that because the price is below the ATC, that this firm would be earning a loss. So if we set a price ceiling at the socially optimum quantity, this firm would be earning a loss, which means we'd have to add an additional support as the government, which would be to subsidize them. So if we wanted to set a socially optimum price ceiling, in this instance, we would also have to give them a subsidy to help them cover their costs and help them make a normal profit. Otherwise, in the long run, this monopoly would stop operating because they wouldn't accept that loss in the long run. Here's a practice multiple choice question. Go ahead and pause the video. See if you can apply what we analyzed last time about consumer surplus and one of the new topics here about monopolies. So the correct answer choice on this one is D. What happens if the firm chooses to produce at the allocatedly efficient level of output rather than the profit maximizing level of output? What happens to consumer surplus? Okay, so let's go to the starting point, which would be the profit maximizing level of output. How do we find that? We looked for where MR equals MC. We would then go to operate at Q1 here. We would then go up to the demand curve to find the price and go over. So we would be charging P5 and producing a quantity of Q1. Where's consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing and able to pay and what they actually pay. So the starting consumer surplus would be here in the red triangle. Okay. If the firm instead moved to producing a socially optimum level of output, could be because of a price ceiling, could be because because maybe for whatever reason, if they choose to do that, what would they do? Well, we would find that socially optimum output level at Q2, which is at this intercept, because that's where price equals a marginal cost. If this firm produced at that level, then the price would then become P4, and I'll choose a different color. Now, the demand curve stayed the same. The new consumer surplus would be the difference between what consumers are willing and able to pay and what they actually pay, which is now P4. So the blue triangle is the new consumer surplus. So you can see it increased by P5, J, K, and P4. Also, because we're the socially optimal output, the deadweight loss would be eliminated as well. Next topic we're going to analyze, now that we've discussed regulating monopolies, is price discrimination. So here's your warm-up question to think about price discrimination. You can pause the video, see what examples you can think of, and then hit play. So many of you probably thought of examples, and this is to introduce the idea of something called price discrimination. We're going to talk about the concept of price discrimination, and then we're going to learn the graph for something called perfect price discrimination. So price discrimination is the practice of selling the same products to different buyers at different prices. Up until now, we've been analyzing monopolies, assuming they charge all consumers the same price. What if they're able to charge consumers different prices? Okay, some examples you may have thought of for this are airline tickets, right? Airline tickets do not charge the same price for a coach seat to all their consumers, right? If you are planning a vacation 6 months in advance and you buy a seat on a plane, you'll probably get a better deal than the businesswoman who has a meeting the next day and needs to buy a ticket on the same flight the day before, right? She's probably going to get charged a higher price. So airline tickets are price discriminators. Hotels are usually price discriminators. Movie theaters are price discriminators by giving child price seats, adult price seats, or senior price seats. Issuing coupons. Someone in your family may be couponers. Those are examples of price discriminating to shoppers at, say, grocery stores, to try to figure out who are the kind of savers who want to spend the time to cut coupons versus who doesn't want to spend the time to do that and are ready to spend. Even a midi football game at some level has some price discrimination because students get a cheaper ticket than your parents do if they come to the game. Okay, so there are many examples, and in fact, in our digital era where our web browsers have lots of information that they've learned about our previous habits, there's more and more opportunities for price discrimination in our economy than there was even 15, 20 years ago. Okay. Price discriminators want to charge each consumer what they're willing and able to pay. Why? Because they want to increase their profits, right? If you can get a higher price out of certain consumers, you're going to increase your profits. And what price discriminating monopolists are going to be able to do is separate out consumers with really inelastic demand for a product and charge them more, and separate those out from consumers with elastic demand. Okay, there are 3 conditions that must be met in order for a firm to price discriminate. The first one is that you must be a price maker. In other words, you can't be a price taker. So if you're a perfectly competitive firm, like we analyzed last unit with those side-by-side graphs, you are not going to be able to price discriminate. Why? Because you're getting the price from the market. You have no control of your price. But monopolists, and then the other 2 market structures that we'll learn next, monopolistic competition and oligopolists, all of them are price makers. So they meet that condition for price discrimination. The second item that needs to be met is you must be able to segregate the market. So you have to figure out how to segregate out different consumers and determine their own individual elasticity of demand. The third thing that you need to be able to do is make sure that consumers cannot resell their product, right? So if the airline industry is a great example of this. If you purchase an airline ticket, your ID must match the name on that ticket. If that wasn't the case and consumers could resell plane tickets, then price discrimination would not work, right? So you have to be able to have a no resale value. So the next question is, what the heck is this going to do to our graph? Let's go back to this diagram. This diagram is what I use to illustrate to you that for monopolies, price does not equal marginal revenue, because in order to sell one more unit, you had to lower the price of units you could have sold at a higher price. Well, how does this relationship change when we look at price discrimination? Okay, in this instance, if we set the price at 10, the quantity demanded would be 1, so our total revenue would be 10, and our marginal revenue would be 10. So far, so good. If we're a price discriminating monopoly, we could still get $10 out of that first consumer, and then if we lower the price to 9 for the second consumer, we could get $9 from her. So in this case, for the second unit, which we charge $9 for, the quantity demanded would be 2, the total revenue would be 19, and the marginal revenue would be 9, and so on and so forth. So what you can see is, if we're price discriminating, we can get $10 out of that consumer who wants it the most, we can get $9 out of that consumer who wants it the second most, and so on and so forth. So if you're a perfect price discriminating monopoly, your price is equal to your marginal revenue, because you're able to charge each consumer exactly what they're willing and able to pay. Therefore, when you price discriminate, your marginal revenue equals your demand curve again. So we have a little bit of a rebirth of Mr. Darp. Not exactly, but sort of. Okay, so that's going to be the big change. All right, Mr. Oleson, what does all this mean for our graph? Let's take a look here. Okay, what you're looking at now is a regular monopoly that's earning a profit, as shown in the green area. Okay, so far so good. What happens if this monopoly now becomes a perfect price discriminator? Okay, the first thing that's going to happen is, like we already established, their demand curve is going to equal their marginal revenue. So the monopoly gang sign goes away. They're jumped out of the monopoly gang, and that separate marginal revenue curve is going to no longer exist, because we're able to charge along our demand curve. So our demand equals marginal revenue. Okay. Once we've done that, then we use all the same skills that we've been using so far. Okay. We're going to find the profit maximizing quantity. The profit maximizing quantity for a price discriminating monopoly is where MR equals MC, which in this instance is right there. So that's the quantity that's going to be produced. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out, where's the price, where's the profit, where's the consumer surplus, and where is the deadweight loss now that we're producing, where this MR equals this MC. Pause the video, give it a try, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so what's going to happen? Where's the price is kind of a trick question. The price is in multiple places. So we're going to charge the price along the demand curve. This consumer was willing and able to pay this price, we get to charge it. This consumer was willing to pay this price, we get to charge it. So if this demand curve represents thousands and thousands of individual consumers, and we're perfect price discriminators, then we're going to be able to charge the price all along the curve. So there's no real price to mark. Okay. Once we choose our profit maximizing quantity, where MR equals MC, we're going to choose that quantity. And then at that quantity, we compare this final price that we charge down to our cost curve, or ATC, and then over. So our profit actually looks like this. Instead of there being consumer surplus, there's no consumer surplus now. We've eaten away into where the consumer surplus would be by charging along the demand curve. There's no consumer surplus because we're able to charge each consumer exactly what they're willing and able to pay. Okay. Once we hit our profit maximizing quantity, we go down to the ATC and over, and this green shape is going to represent our profit. Okay. There's also no deadweight loss. Reason is because we are at the socially optimum quantity. Our profit maximizing quantity, where MR equals MC, also is where marginal cost equals price. Okay. So this is the socially optimum quantity, which means we have no deadweight loss. Okay. So that's what a price discriminating monopoly looks like. Something interesting to consider is they actually produce more, right? So compared to, I'll draw the old marginal revenue curve on here just so we get a direct comparison. The profit maximizing quantity is going to increase, so we're going to produce more, and then we're going to charge everybody along the demand curve, but the quantity will actually increase. Price discrimination results in several prices, more profit, no CS, and a higher socially optimum quantity. Okay, so now that we've moved towards the end of this video, over the last 2 lessons, after working on these last 2 lessons, you should be able to do 3 things in comparison now. The first thing you should be able to do is draw a regular monopoly, a regular non-price discriminating monopoly, making a profit that's at long run equilibrium, and you should be able to identify its price, its quantity, and its profit. And you should also be able to do, from last unit, you should be able to draw perfectly competitive side-by-side firms and industries, and you should be able to draw that in long run equilibrium. And then you should also be able to draw a price discriminating monopoly that's at equilibrium, and then label the quantity, the marginal revenue, the profit, and the price. So go ahead and take out a blank piece of paper, try it, see if you can do all these and label them correctly and make the distinctions between the 3. If you can do this right now without your notes, you're in a really good place right now. And it's a great little quiz to see how you're doing so far, to check for your own understanding. It's one thing to kind of follow along and watch me go through the graphs, but it's another thing to actually do it on your own. So take this opportunity to get some extra practice in. All right, wonderful humans. The last thing I will leave you with is this little riddle. If we start pouring milk into these glasses, the question is, which glass gets full first? Come back to class with your answer. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.